Good afternoon and welcome to the latest webinar of the TSU, the Technical Support Unit of the NAMA facility. Hi everyone, my name is Ash Sharma. I am the Senior Advisor to the NAMA facility and I'll be moderating this afternoon's webinar. I'm very pleased to see the high number of participants. We have, I believe, 240 colleagues from all over the world who have registered. So also good morning and good evening to some of you. And thank you all very much for joining us. The objective of today's webinar is to reflect on lessons learned during the fifth call. And I hope we can provide you with some food for thought. On the following slide, you can see the TSU colleagues who are involved in today's webinar. Next to me, you can see Mabel, Natasha, and Zach. Natasha and Mabel are in charge of the technical functioning of the webinar. And Zach and I will guide us through the content of this webinar and answer your questions in the Q&A sessions. Before going into details, I will pass over to my colleague Mabel, who will guide you through some of the technical aspects of today's webinar. Mabel, please.
Thank you, Ash, and hello everyone. First, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the control panel of the webinar, which you can see here on the right of the PowerPoint slide. I'll show you using the mouse. We have several settings, but I'm going to take you through the main important ones. First of all, we have the control panel, which you can hide. Then second, we have the mute setting. Due to the high number of participants in this webinar, all participants are on mute and you will not be able to unmute yourself. Then third, we have the webinar in full screen. You can view the webinar in full screen using this button. This can be useful because the webinar is going to be accompanied by a presentation. Then you can also adjust the language of the control panel using the globe, which you can find on the top of the control panel. And finally, we have the question tab. In this tab, you can ask questions throughout the session. You can type in the question window, which you can find in the control panel. We, the webinar hosts, will be the only one who can see it. We'll answer the questions in the questions and answer session, so please submit them beforehand. I will now hand over back to Ash for a brief introduction to the NAMA facility. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mabel. Actually, we have our first question already, and I'll just take that right now. The question was around documentation. The presentation and a recording of this will be made available after the webinar. So please do note that you don't need to take notes. Everything will be uploaded later on. Okay, so first of all, let's look at today's agenda. Just now, as part of the first part of the webinar, I will provide you with a short introduction to the NAMA facility. Then Zach will provide a short overview of the applications received in this year's fifth call and outline the selection process and some general findings to date. In the third part, I will share a detailed analysis and some of the lessons learned from the fifth call applications and the experience of previous calls that we've had. And in the last section, Zach will present some technology or sector-specific lessons learned. We will have two breaks for questions and answers. The first will be during the part on lessons learned and one at the end. So we'd like to keep these to around 5 to 10 minutes each. So please be sure to submit your questions in the questions window as they occur to you. We'll do our best to try and address these during the subsequent Q&A sessions. And we will come back to you if we cannot answer the questions directly. Okay, let's begin with the introduction to the NAMA facility. The NAMA facility is an instrument which supports developing countries and emerging economies in implementing ambitious NAMAs. These programs can function as an important building block to implement nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs, under the Paris Agreement. NAMAs are voluntary climate protection measures undertaken by developing countries and emerging economies, which are embedded in national strategies for low carbon development. The NAMA facility was established by the German Federal Ministry for the Environment and the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in 2012. Since then, the European Commission and the Danish government have joined as additional donors. The representatives of these donor institutions are members of the board of the NAMA facility, which is the central decision-making body. So far, the donors have made available a total of almost 350 million euros for support to date. The TSU is the secretariat of the facility and is responsible, among other things, for organizing the calls for the NAMA support projects. So, what do we support? We support and provide funding for so-called NAMA support projects, which have the potential to catalyze transformational change towards low-carbon development. As there is only limited funding available, the NAMA facility has to focus its support on the most ambitious and transformational of the NAMA support projects. To identify these, we organize calls for proposals. In the previous 4 calls, 22 projects have been selected for support. Funding decisions on the 5th call will be made available in due course on our website. So, the NAMA facility provides a combination of financial and technical measures to support the most ambitious parts of the sector-wide NAMA. These NAMA support projects typically have a duration of 3 to 5 years and can receive funding in the order of 5 to 20 million euros each. The key selection criteria are that they should be ready for actual implementation of mitigation actions and that they should be ambitious in terms of mitigation potential, financial leverage, and the potential for transformation. We will touch on more of these points during today's webinar. I would also like to point out that the NAMA facility does not have any regional or sector focus. I would now like to ask my colleague Zach to provide an overview of the recently closed 5th call. Zach, please.
Thank you, Ash. So let's take a look at the results of the current 5th call for NAMA support projects. In the 5th call, 76 submissions were received, showing a large regional spread. 16 outlines were resubmissions. Out of the 76 outlines, 2 were determined to be ineligible and were thus not assessed. 23 outlines came from 15 different least developed countries, or LDCs, and 13 outlines were submitted from 9 small island developing states, or SIDS. In total, over 1 billion euros of funding was requested, averaging 14.4 million euros per outline. Submissions from a wide range of sectors were submitted, with the largest share focusing on climate actions in the energy sector, comprised of both renewable energy and energy efficiency, followed by submissions from forestry and land use, waste and wastewater treatment, as well as transport and agriculture. We also received a wide range of submissions across geographic locales, including 26 submissions from African countries, 28 from the Americas, 20 from Asia, and 1 from Europe. That was a short introduction to the NAMA facility and the results of the 5th call NAMA support projects. And now we'll move on to the core of the webinar, the analysis and lessons learned from the 5th call experience. These observations also build on the experience of previous calls. For this, I will pass you back over to my colleague, Ash Sharma, who will take us through this section of the webinar.
Thanks, Zach. Okay, so we move on to the next part, which is the lessons learned. So in general, the key factors for success that we observed were ambition and feasibility, as mentioned previously, but also a high financial ambition. So in this regard, we refer to the high leveraging of public and private funding. Also, the linkage between the NAMA and the NDC was very important. And not least of all, a high potential for transformational change. So this is the transformation towards the low carbon trajectory, which is of course one of the core objectives of the NAMA facility. Before we move on to the criterion specific findings, perhaps we could just share some of the general observations that we made on the fifth call outlines that we received. First of all, in terms of greenhouse gas calculations, we found that applicants often didn't provide as much detail as possible. In many cases, a detailed model was used to generate emission reduction estimates, but no information was provided to allow us and the evaluators an opportunity to check their credibility. So please avoid a black box scenario and allow us to check calculations. In terms of the log frame, many applicants missed some of the indicators. So please ensure that all 5 indicators, mandatory indicators, are completed. Also, we saw that direct emissions often lacked units and indirect emissions were not considered at all. In terms of monitoring, reporting and verification, MRV, we noted that some projects did not include M&E or monitoring and evaluation in their log frame. In the financial table, which is very important, many applicants appeared confused by the table in section 4.1. We will try to provide further clarification to describe what goes in each column and row in future calls. In terms of implementation, applicants should ensure that implementation issues are addressed in detail so that a credible understanding of how the project will operate and deliver emission reductions is made. In terms of synergies, projects should demonstrate an awareness of lessons learned from pilot activities and related initiatives, and moreover show how these have informed the design of the proposed project. So what has worked well and what has not worked, why, and how this can be taken up in the proposal. In terms of technology selection and application, applicants should research and demonstrate awareness of the best practice in their sector or technology. The current and proposed technologies to be deployed should be well described at this point. The latter's economic and technical viability in the given country context should be addressed. Where pilots have been proposed, we would expect that projects are considered feasible within the aforementioned timescale, taking into account issues such as procurement, land use, environmental and social concerns, as we will be checking this in our evaluation. And finally, on this slide, enforcement issues. Often we see that regulatory reforms are proposed in response to low compliance. But this should include specific activities to address and track the enforcement of these regulations also. Okay, now to move to some project design related questions or issues. We've seen that in terms of ability to pay, the feasibility needs to be demonstrated. For example, where models assume revenues from user fees, these should be somehow verified in pilot projects or via field surveys. After the transitional support of the NAMA facility, the new technology should be priced within the affordability of the identified target groups on an ongoing basis. In terms of risks, we saw that these were often omitted from project log frames. Please note also that risks and assumptions are not the same thing. And furthermore, we believe that projects should consider political risks, for example, relating to introducing fees and taxes or the presence of a culture of non-payment. So please do take risks into consideration. In terms of community linkages, the involvement of NGOs and civil society organizations are often seldom considered. So please do consider these. As regards behavioral change, livelihood and behavioral change issues need to be addressed in the barrier analysis, particularly as relates to projects that can displace traditional lifestyles. So projects relating to transportation, waste management, household energy, for instance. We would also encourage an integrated approach being undertaken. So, for instance, disposal issues relating to the disposal of air conditioning units, for instance, or diesel engine swap out projects, typically didn't consider what would happen to these items. It's important, therefore, to consider the value chain in its entirety, from the technology adoption to the recycling of equipment and disposal. So now we move on to general comments on the ambition criteria. Here we found that outlines which scored highly demonstrated strong government commitment, or what we refer to as embeddedness. So therefore, the proponents should demonstrate the relevance of the project, of the NAMA support project, in the national sector context, i.e. show that the sector in question commands the government attention in terms of mitigation policies or builds on existing initiatives. Also, as mentioned, the relationship to the relevant NDC should be clearly articulated at this point. The significance of the sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is also very important. So, for instance, sectors which contribute, say, more than 5% of national emissions would be in a good position to show that they are significant. In terms of transformational change, this is the cornerstone of the NAMA facility. Here, the best proposals that we saw demonstrated the host government's willingness to put into effect an irreversible change towards the low carbon pathway, which is faster than the business as usual technical trajectory. So we see this evidence in a number of ways. First of all, policy reforms and fiscal regulatory instruments, such as limitations or bans or phase outs, the use of economic fees and other instruments, including fossil fuel subsidy reforms and redirection of other harmful subsidies. The description here of any windows of opportunity which make such structural changes timely should be provided also. For instance, the introduction of a new biofuel law. We note here also that the outline or the project proposal should go beyond a conventional project scenario. What we mean here is that, for instance, a on-grid PV power plant is in itself a good low-carbon investment, but it may not score well on transformation. Another example would be a typical replacement scenario, which replaces outmoded technology, but is essentially a business as usual exercise and does not make an irreversible change over time. I would note also here that national initiatives usually have a stronger case for transformation. If a national program is not practicable, for example, in a very large country, then one should show how is scaling up and replication foreseen in practice at, let's say, a regional level. Okay, so moving on to financial ambition. Again, another key aspect. This is best evidenced by the leveraging of private sector capital. For instance, investors' equity, bank loans, user fees, tariffs, and or the mobilization of domestic public sector funding. And here, for instance, the allocation of budgetary support at a domestic level is very important. The co-financing from official development assistance and other donors is also a very nice to have criteria, but is by no means essential. In terms of mitigation potential, this is again important because the NAMA facility is first and foremost a climate change mitigation instrument. But we do see that, and we continue to see that mitigation potential is often overestimated or poorly substantiated. The estimation of indirect mitigation potential is very often missing completely in the proposals. And finally, I should say that the greenhouse gas emission reductions should be cost effective in terms of euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. So now we move on to general findings on feasibility. So here I would note the importance of a plausible project rationale and scope. So what I mean here is this could be evidenced by a comprehensive and substantiated barrier analysis. So for instance, how specifically does the NAMA support project overcome identified economic and financial barriers? It should also make very clear and describe target groups or end users. In terms of implementation readiness, this has to be demonstrated taking into account the DPP or the detailed project preparation phase and up to 5 years of implementation. We will return to this point later on when we discuss sectors and technologies. Also, as previously mentioned, the best outlines analyze the lessons learned and which, for instance, which strategies and mechanisms worked well rather than just simply to list the initiatives. So now we move on to business models. When we say business model, we take to mean the economic viability of the project concept for the target group, be it the end users or other market actors and or producers or suppliers. For instance, business models should be considered from the perspective, let's say, for energy efficiency, from the perspective of building owners, for renewable energy in terms of energy consumers, and for improved cook stoves from the perspective of households. So we found that the most convincing outlines address the following issues. First of all, the economic and other motivations of each group were adequately described. The rationale of the project's cost effectiveness or profitability was well identified. Also, proponents should describe the incentives to change behavior, also to change the flow of capital or investment, taking into account market conditions and issues such as competitiveness and pricing. Again, this is referring to the affordability issue. We should also note that the best proposals demonstrated using calculations and evidence on issues related to, for instance, price differentials between current and the low carbon technologies. Operating costs and investment appraisal is very helpful here also, so we can get a view on the profitability of these projects in terms of IRR, break-even points, payback times, etc. And please, any assumptions that are made should be justified. For instance, references should be made to recent studies or field work. Also, we would strongly recommend that applicants complete Annex B to the full extent possible. Next, our experience on business models has indicated that business cases which build primarily on capital cost or CapEx subsidies are rarely considered to be transformational. And typically these do offer a very low leveraging rate, so tend to score low. So please avoid market distortions that may, for example, preferentially treat one or few actors, and please ensure that a fair and transparent process is in place for the allocation of capital. As mentioned before, the NAMA facility typically supports only a minor share of capital expenditures. Demonstration projects are often proposed, but these are typically based on proof of concept, implying that a self-sustaining business model will take root once the technology is demonstrated. This is not always a given. In general, this assertion needs to be better substantiated. A bankable business case should be made regarding how the NAMA support project will become replicable and scalable, given that the projects supported by the facility have received typically a higher share of grant or subsidy, and essentially are being undertaken in the absence of real-life financial conditions. So the higher the capital subsidy, the less likely that market participants later on can emulate the model, say through conventional bank loans. Okay, so now we move on to financial mechanisms in some more detail. The structuring and the use of financial mechanisms to achieve the objectives of the NAMA facility. Here we make a number of observations and recommendations. First of all, I'm pleased to note that, again, many proposals have used innovative financing mechanisms from a possible menu of instruments, particularly with the high emphasis on the high leveraging of NAMA facility funding. The observations we would make is that, first of all, the degree of concessionality that's used should be relative to the country context. So, for instance, higher concessionality for lower income countries and least developed countries. Also, a clear rationale for the selection of the financial instruments should be presented with the proposal. The design of the financing scheme should be outlined in detail. So, for instance, considering fiduciary and legal aspects, contractual obligations, documentation requirements, guidance to borrowers, etc. But we do recognize that this should be elaborated further at the DPP stage or at the implementation phases. The NAMA facility also expects that the financing mechanism should be functional and operational within the first year of the implementation. The financing mechanism should be based on the business model and take into account an analysis of market conditions with, for example, consideration of the sophistication of the banking sector, the existence of financing instruments in that country, and the coverage of the users that are proposed. For instance, in many instances, we've seen that banks are unwilling to finance technologies which are not proven in the country context. Market distortions should be avoided, and for instance, we have the case where highly subsidized loans may not be appropriate, where there is a well-functioning banking sector already in place. And finally, on this slide, the risk assessment. We find that a comprehensive risk assessment is often lacking. For instance, proposed loan facilities rarely discuss the risk of defaults or non-payment, and these sorts of issues should be included. In terms of the phase-out concept, the sustainability beyond the 5-year frame of the NAMA support project also applies to the financial instruments themselves. So here one should explain how our remaining funds that, for example, in a revolving loan fund or a guarantee facility, how will they be utilized beyond the term of the NAMA support project and under what criteria? The institutional arrangements are important also. So the financial entity should apply fair and transparent selection rules for allocating financial support, as we mentioned earlier. It should demonstrate good governance, so how funds are overseen and how the fiduciary responsibility is undertaken. Transaction costs should be described wherever possible and should be reasonable. Okay, so now we'll have our first Q&A session. Let's see what questions we've received from our applicants. Zach, do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, we sure do, Ash. Thanks for that. Let's we're gathering the questions here right now.
Okay, so should we take the first one?
Yeah, you bet. Okay, so Beatrice asked a question. She's in Kenya. She's wondering if we could explain what we mean by concessionality.
Okay, thanks for that question, Beatrice. Well, concessionality refers to loans that are being undertaken at lower than market rates. So these are effectively subsidized by grants. And generally, donors are minded to offer higher concessionality to, let's say, lower income countries in view of their economic and financial context. Any more questions? Good take.
Okay. Yeah, there's one more here. We have Ahmed from Afghanistan. He was wondering, does the NAMA facility support both project and policy NAMAs?
Okay, well, the NAMA facilities projects typically have a technical and a financial component. So I guess in that sense, the technical component usually has some policy and regulatory reforms as part of it. So yes, the answer to your question is yes. Typically, we do support both. And of course, if you have a project which has a policy element to it, which changes the dynamic in terms of gearing something towards a lower carbon trajectory, then of course that would score better in our evaluation.
We also had one more question from Louise. She was wondering what the maximum funding volume there is available for a NAMA support project.
Okay, so this sort of information is given in the general information document that goes with each call. Typically, we've been using a maximum of 20 million euros. So that's been the maximum so far. I think in exceptional cases, we will consider higher amounts, but they should be justified. But please do refer wherever possible to the general information document. You'll find that many of these are already, or they should still be on the website from the previous call. If not, we can always provide those as well.
Okay, great. We also have Simon asking, what happens to NAMA facility funding that goes unused at the end of a project? What kind of options are there for using these funds, or what happens?
Okay, well, thanks for that question. I think that where funding is unused, the project design should just clearly describe how those funds will be redeployed. So, as I mentioned, with the guarantee facility, if there's unused capital, so if the guarantees are not being called, then there will be funding available at the end. So the capital is being preserved. So the project design should take into account what will happen with that funding after the end of the 5 years. So, for instance, you may have a scheme of dispersing this through grants or through other avenues, but again, one would need to stick to the criteria of being transformational to engendering that transformational change. Okay, well, we've taken quite a few questions there. Maybe we should move on. So please do keep your questions coming in, and we will do our best to try to respond to as many of them as possible. And where we can't take them now, we will try to respond to you in the days and weeks after this webinar. Okay, well, thank you for your questions. Now I'll pass you over to Zach, who will take us through some of the sector and technology specific considerations. Over to you, Zach.
Great. Thank you very much, Ash. So in the fifth call, we received proposals drawn from a wide typology, and we can't address each one separately. However, we do consider it instructive to outline some of the lessons learned for 6 different project types. The first one we'll take a look at here is the transport sector, and we've made several observations. Public transport requires stakeholder consultations and involvement of municipalities. Transport initiatives are long-term infrastructure projects, and they have long gestation times, so plan realistically regarding preparation timelines. Take a comprehensive approach to M&E, not just greenhouse gas emissions, including progress metrics, performance indicators, and economic co-benefits to be able to assess and improve policy performance. Depending on robust M&E capacity, developing robust M&E capacity takes time. So develop a plan to gather essential short-term data and to build capacity for comprehensive measurement in a phased manner. Coordination among ministries is essential to align policies. Investments can have the potential to conflict, but if well coordinated, they can advance greenhouse gas, economic, and social equity goals. Regarding the e-mobility programs, we have some important points here. Infrastructure such as loading stations is crucial. Scrapping schemes for old vehicles are very important for direct mitigation impacts. Assumptions with regard to price parity are crucial as well. Reducing import tariffs can play a crucial role to trigger change. Additional subsidies are not always necessary here. Communication and awareness are also both very important. Taxis and public vehicles can also play an important role. The next type of project we're going to take a look at here is energy efficiency in buildings. We have several more observations to note. Proposals have often been too generic. They need to more clearly identify the subsector in which the particular intervention is tailored to achieve the real impact, such as with commercial versus public sectors. The owner-user dilemma needs to be considered. That is, the owner of a building usually pays the cost of energy efficiency measures, while the user benefits from any savings. If the interests are not aligned, this raises questions of cost-benefit sharing. A holistic or whole building approach should be used instead of covering only low-hanging fruit by, for example, simply replacing lighting, air conditioning, boilers, etc. Simple replacement scenarios have a low transformational effect as well. The quality, safety, and performance of equipment, it's important to be considered and described. Rebound effects should also be considered, as these can lead to underachievement of efficiency gains, such as scrappage schemes for old appliances. Direct rebound effects occur through increased demand for the product, it's getting cheaper through the efficiency gain. Indirect effects happen if the savings from the efficiency are used for other climate unfriendly spending. Another common project type is a solid waste management project, and we have some more observations here as well. First, it's important to consider the scope of the NSP, that it's not so wide that it becomes infeasible. The waste management hierarchy is a guiding principle here. The focus should be more on upstream rather than end-of-pipe activities, such as just landfills. The sustainability of the financing model to ensure cost coverage, including capital and operating elements, is critical. And information is needed on the composition of waste streams, also with references to studies. The proposal should be demonstrating the feasibility of certain technologies based on an assessment of alternatives, preferably in a context-specific feasibility study. Social aspects of workers and the inclusion of traditional waste pickers should also be considered and not overlooked. The implementation timescale should also adequately address site selection of waste treatment facilities, permits and licenses, environmental and social impact assessments, and public procurement. Next, we'll take a look at some general comments we have observed on renewable energy projects. As with all projects, the transformational effect needs to be clearly demonstrated. That is how the NAMA support project triggers a sectoral change instead of simply financing a single or a few projects. The technological solution should be analyzed with regard to alternatives in terms of CapEx, disaggregated and justified as appropriate, and ownership and operation OpEx, availability of water and other resources such as biomass and wind should also be taken into consideration. Regarding mini grids, the geographical spread of connected households and businesses is a key cost factor. The higher the investment into the grid, the more the project is about energy access and not mitigation. The ability and even willingness to pay of the target group must also be demonstrated. And anchor clients should ideally be identified at the outline stage. The effect of fossil fuel subsidies, if applicable, on the NAMA support project should also be analyzed, as well as other relevant regulations like national energy tariffs and so on. Next, we'll take a look at supply chain projects. The rationale or narrative of an integrated supply chain project must be clear in these cases. It is important to present an analysis of all relevant concerned sectors of the supply chain, not just the main sector of the NAMA support project, the main sector that the NAMA support project is focusing on, even if not all of the sectors are equally funded by the NAMA support project. Be sure to avoid over-complexity that can come across when working in too many different sectors, where each has its own regulatory authority, implementing partner, different policies. This can impact the feasibility of the NSP. And undertaking pilots in different sectors in order to cope with complexity is not optimal, because these pilots might not exactly transform the sector. So be careful of doing that as well. Now we'll take a look at some general comments we have regarding the agriculture and forestry sectors. Some questions have been raised around labeling and certification that are often cited in outlines. And some of these include questions like, is the certification cost covered by higher prices for labeled or certified products and services? And if not, what is the business case? Is there a substantiated demand for labels or certificates? What is the likely acceptance at the national or international market? And how does the envisaged label or certificate compare to other labels or certificates? Environmental issues here also warrant specific consideration, of course. Things like are land use changes, conflicts, and the monitoring thereof in the NAMA support project context considered? Is the availability or scarcity of water and potential conflicts surrounding water use considered and addressed? For example, in the context of irrigated agriculture? How is biodiversity addressed, such as through the use of endemic species or the avoidance of monocultures? Have environmental impacts been assessed, and how are they addressed? Are there safeguards? And is there a relevant regulatory framework in place and enforced? How are rebound effects considered and addressed? For example, in the meat production industry, when increased productivity could lead to an increase of herds. Upscaling here may also be difficult. Farmers live in different regions. They need a good platform for information sharing. Working with cooperatives as a way forward, as more organized, can be easier to reach the farmers and to implement new practices. Justify the appropriateness of pilot regions to introduce new farming practices. And information about the target group is crucial, but usually incomplete, such as for things like the socioeconomic situation and the breakdown to individual cases and country. Sustainability of the proposed technologies or practices after NSP is completed is also quite important. Regarding the forestry industry, could the NAMA support project use the REDD+ mechanism? What is the additionality to applying the mechanism? How is the leakage problem addressed? And how does the NSP engage with relevant stakeholders, including local communities, and how are main polluters, for example, wood or agro-industry, engaged? Finally, let's take a look at improved cook stoves. Based on our experience, it's important to address the following issues here. It's important to provide a convincing market assessment that addresses both the economic and the non-economic, for example, cultural or behavioral barriers to the uptake of more efficient stoves. Particularly important here, given that payback periods are often short at 6 to 12 months. How is the affordability issue, the provision of end user financing, for example, microfinance, carbon financing, etc., addressed? What are the maintenance provisions to ensure that the stoves remain efficient and generate emission reductions reliably? Be sure to explain how the NSP differs from existing cook stove programs as well. For instance, how does it build on and incorporate previous lessons learned? Be sure to address stove stacking issues. And don't forget that a credible sales, marketing, and distribution plan is required for scaled up disseminations of improved cook stoves. And lastly here, be sure to demonstrate the sustainability of fuel sources addressed by the NSP and beyond the scope of the NSP. So this concludes the section on the sector and technology specific lessons learned. Now I'd like to hand things back over to my colleague Ash.
Okay, thanks a lot, Zach, for that. So now we have quite a few minutes now for a final Q&A session. And I think we seem to have got quite a few more questions.
Okay, great, Ash, thanks. Let me take a look at what we've got here. Looks like Sandra asks, what does significant mobilization of verifiable domestic, public, and private sector mean in percentage terms?
Okay, so that's a difficult question. We don't have any benchmarks in this regard, but again, one needs to make the case in the country context, and of course, the higher the leveraging, the better for the NSP. But of course, we do ask that it's verifiable. So, for instance, if there are public resources being promised, that these should be somehow evidenced. So, is there a law that's coming in? How far away is this law, and so forth?
Okay, great. Thanks for that. There's another one here from many participants. Probably the most popular question: will there be a sixth call? And if so, when will it be announced? Okay, so that's the $1 million question, or higher, I should say. Unfortunately, we are not in a position at the moment to give a date or indeed to confirm that there will be a sixth call. But typically, the donors have made funding available on an annual basis. So last year, this was announced at the time of the COP, and we would recommend that all interested parties stay in touch with us through the mailing list and through the technical media, and we will be in touch on that. But unfortunately, we don't have an immediate answer for that. Sorry. Okay, thanks. And if I can just add to that, as Ash said, be sure to check out our website and sign up for our newsletter for the latest updates. So it looks like Steve here was asking, what was the range of financial leverage ratios in the portfolio? Okay, well, thank you for that question. We did an analysis for the first 3 calls, and there we found that across the first 3 calls, the typical or the average leveraging ratio
was 1 to 7.6. So that meant that for every euro of NAMA facility funding, the project leveraged or mobilized another 7.6 euros. And that, I believe, broke down primarily to around 3 euros of public support and about 4 euros of private support. But I don't have the exact numbers, and we haven't updated that analysis to include the fourth call.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks, Ash. We've got another question here from, looks like Ugan. He is asking, in the context of rural areas, the cost of technology development is prohibitive. Hence, there is a need for subsidies as there are no financial institutions in these areas. So he's asking, is a subsidy-driven project a no-no for NAMA facility support?
Well, actually, no, that's a good question. And I know the country that you're from, Ugan, and I can see that in terms of the country context, we would never say that it's a no-no as such. However, we would say that subsidy-driven projects should demonstrate sustainability in the long term. So, for example, if you are providing subsidies, how will this impact the affordability going forward? The same comments I made about demonstration projects is relevant here as well. So once the subsidies are withdrawn or phased out, will the technology still be competitive? So I think I would also add, in regard of rural areas, any aspects of regulatory or policy reforms which can make those lower carbon technologies relevant in that sector would offer a more sustainable and lasting transformational impact. Okay, do we have any more questions to hand? Okay.
Well, we have one here. Let's see. So what is the positioning of the NAMA facility on the use of CERs or other credits, emission credits? Sorry, that's running down the screen. Or other emission credits beyond the land use sector?
Okay, so here you're referring to certified emission reductions from the Clean Development Mechanism. In terms of the emission credits that are generated by projects, we typically ask that these projects retire the credits, so the credits cannot be used for compliance purposes outside the scheme. So we do have 1 or 2 examples of this only in the portfolio, and we don't preclude the use of CERs, but we have seen that the application of these is rather limited. If you are going to use the carbon mechanisms and carbon instruments, please do ensure that credits are retired, and they can be used, I would add, also as a form of results-based financing, provided again that they are retired and not used for compliance purposes.
Okay, thanks for that, Ash. We have another one here from Trang. Trang is asking, which methodology should be used for greenhouse gas emission calculations? And since it should be in detail and not as a black box, should all emissions be listed, or should insignificant emissions be left out?
Okay, well, my advice to you, Trang, would be to provide as much detail as possible, list the assumptions, use established methodologies. So, for instance, if there are clean development methodologies being used or applicable, please use those, and allow us enough information that we can break down the calculations. If you can provide as much information as possible, that would be appreciated. Yeah, the other point I would make on that is, if you don't have applicable methodologies, that's also fine, but just show you're working and, for instance, use any assumptions in terms of emission factors and have everything clearly referenced. Okay.
Do we have time for another question?
I believe we do, yes.
Okay, great. So we have Ruben here. He's asking, why would you say forestry or land use projects are lagging behind other sectors?
I'm not sure. We typically haven't had a lot of credible projects from that area, so I'm not sure I can answer that question. But again, as I mentioned before, we don't preclude any technology or project types. So yeah, we try to provide some guidance today, and hopefully that would assist applicants in their decision to make a proposal. Yeah.
Okay, so we have another one here from Dario. Dario is asking, is the NAMA facility aiming to have certain sectoral or geographical composition?
Okay, so the simple answer to that one is no. We don't have any sectoral or geographic portfolio limits. So we've supported projects in the energy sector, energy efficiency and renewables quite a lot, in the transport sector, and we have a wide variety of geographic jurisdictions that we work in. So the donors are not or have stipulated that there are no geographic or technology concerns. And for instance, we have more than one project in a couple of our countries already. So we have 2 in Thailand, we have 3 in Mexico, for instance.
Great, thanks for that, Ash. There's one more here from Rowan. Rowan's asking if the NAMA facility only supports the immediate implementation of projects, or if there are preparation measures that the NAMA facility could help provide.
Okay, thanks for that question. The NAMA facility supports implementation projects only, so I'm afraid we cannot provide funding for the preparation of projects in terms of outlines. However, of course, projects do receive a detailed project preparation funding, but they have to demonstrate that they are sufficiently advanced that at the end of that DPP phase, they can move to a full-scale mitigation project. So, yeah, unfortunately, we don't fund the development of concepts and early-stage NAMA development. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of our time. Thank you all for your questions. We will try and revert to all of you, and hopefully that has been useful for you. We hope that you've also found the observations that we've made helpful. I would like to highlight the following news and future events at the NAMA facility. We do try to be a learning hub. We're trying to always improve our processes and adding materials to allow lessons to be learnt. We try to distribute these lessons as widely as we can, for example, through this webinar. I would also draw your attention to an open technical workshop that we had on lessons learned that took place on the 4th of May in Bonn this year during the SBI meeting, the subsidiary body for implementation meetings. And the outputs from this workshop, I hope, will be of interest to you. They can be found at this link here. We will hopefully organize a special webinar on lessons learned, particularly relating to the use of the financial instruments later this year. And we will endeavor to have a dissemination event again at this year's COP, the COP24 in Katowice in Poland. So further information on the results of the 5th call will be announced in due course. So please do stay in touch with us. Last but not least, you will be provided with a link to the documentation of the webinar that will be sent through to you by email. And for any other information, please do not hesitate to contact us. And don't forget to register for the NAMA facility newsletter if you're not already signed up. And please do visit our website. So finally, thank you all for your participation and for your questions. I wish you a very pleasant day. Thank you.